Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you at the NIICE Global Conclave from the labs of the beautiful Himalayas, where the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is located. The think tank was established in the month of February in the year 2016. It undertakes independent research in the field of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and development. Has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Security and Strategic Studies. The Institute focuses on 8 research topics: climate change and energy, global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, refugee and migration, China's Belt and Road Initiative, border and transboundary water politics, Indo-Pacific affairs, disaster management, and international economy and development. Previously, NIICE has had the opportunity to host distinguished speakers from all around the globe.
Pleasure me to speak here at NIICE.
It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with all of you.
Well, thank you anyway, and I certainly admire the work that you're doing.
I'm very happy to be with you all.
NIICE Global Conclave is the flagship event of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. The theme of the 3-day conference is connecting Nepal to the world by bringing in leaders, diplomats, business leaders, and scholars from all around the globe. The objective of this conclave is to introduce Nepal to the world and at the same time update the Nepalese policymakers and experts about the fast-changing geopolitics, which will help Nepal to reshape its foreign policy to achieve its national goal. This is the session 12 of the conference. The session that we're going to have is on Beyond Neighborhood. And chair and moderate this session, we are to have Captain Alok Bansal here with us. Captain Bansal is a director at India Foundation, and he is also an adjunct professor at New Delhi Institute of Management and the Secretary General of the Asian Eurasian Human Rights Forum. He was the founder and executive director of the South Asian Institute for Strategic Affairs and a visiting professor at the Pakistan Studies Program at Jamia Millia Islamia. He has been the executive director of the National Maritime Foundation and has also worked with IDSA and PLOS. He has also been appointed as the adjunct professor in Tibetan Studies Center of Central University at Himachal Pradesh. Captain Bansal, in his 32-year service at Indian Navy, participated in Operation Pawan in Sri Lanka and has commanded 2 warships. He has several publications on his name. And so without any further
thank you. I think I'm not able to hear your audio clearly. Maybe there is some problem. But thanks a lot to NIICE and Pramod Jaiswal for this wonderful webinar. In my decades-long academic career, I have never seen a webinar of this magnitude, where so many speakers from across the continents have participated in a webinar like this. And I have, by and large, attended almost all the sessions. Since they were being conducted parallelly, I could not attend all, but I have tried and participated, at least heard with rapt attentions most of the speakers that I could. And this has, of course, been feasible because being in South Asia, the timings are extremely suitable. And that takes me to South Asia. South Asia historically has been a cultural monolith. It has a fairly well-defined geographical entity and has led a fairly insular existence. But despite that, the neighborhood has always affected it. and beyond its neighborhood. When we talk in South Asian context, we talk of neighborhood, it's our immediate neighbors. But the regions beyond our neighborhood, be it Central Asia, West Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, they have from time to time affected us. And I think, I guess in this particular session, we would be discussing these regions or countries within these regions which lie beyond our neighborhood. Even extra-regional powers which have actually had enormous influence in this particular part of the world. So in this particular session, we have a large number of luminaries who would be speaking, and we have speakers from countries from like Afghanistan, Russia, Israel. I'm not sure if our first speaker has come, so we will shift the order in which we were trying to work out this particular session. So since the Dr. Mirwais Balkhi, as has been told to me by the organizers, is not yet logged in, we would begin with the Professor Dr. Victoria Panova, who is the Vice President of International Relations at Far Eastern Federal University. And she also holds the post of Scientific Supervisor of the BRICS Expert Council and Managing Director of the National Committee of BRICS Research. She's also been the Associate Professor and Deputy Head of the Department of International Relations and Foreign Policy at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. She has served as Regional Director for Russia of the G8 Research Group, University of Toronto, and was member of the National Working Group of Advisory Council and part of the Common European Security project. Since 2015, she is co-chair of the Civil BRICS process initiated by Russian civil society, permanent member of the jury for the youth. She was also the visiting fellow and life member at the University of Cambridge, London School of Economics, BRICS Policy Center, etc., etc. So without much ado, over to Dr. Victoria. You have 10 to 12 minutes. You could start now.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bansal. One thing, I think Mr. Balkhi has just entered. So if you want to keep their initial order, probably we could shift to them, and then I will be speaking as it was initially designed. Probably there was something behind it. So if you're willing to do that, I see Mr. Balkhi right there.
I was not aware, but yeah, I can see Mirwais Balkhi. So I would, I think, revert back to the original order, and will request the first speaker, who is Dr. Mirwais Balkhi, who will be speaking to us on role of Qatar in Afghanistan peace process, leverages and challenges. As you know, Qatar is where the Taliban office is located. The Taliban external office has been located, and Dr. Balkhi, as you know, served as the Minister of Education for the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. He was also the Deputy Ambassador of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan in New Delhi and Head of Africa and Middle East Desk, Center for Strategic Studies, and the Chief Editor of the CSS Quarterly Journal of Strategic Studies at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Prior to joining the CSS, Dr. Balkhi was a lecturer at the Law and Political Science faculty at American University of Afghanistan and served with many other private universities. He has done his PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University in International Affairs and has authored Saudi Arabia's Foreign Policy Towards Afghanistan, Balkhis of India, and a critique on Afghanistan's regional integration. A renowned academic and a politician. Without wasting much time, over to Dr. Balkhi. Dr. Balkhi, you have 10 to 12 minutes for your topic. Over to you.
Dr. Bansal and Chair, and thanks everyone here. I'm very sorry to be a little late because of the electricity problem that we have here nowadays in Kabul. I'm sure that you have my voice clear, everyone. Thank you very much. Well, my topic has been the assessment of Qatar's role in peace process in Afghanistan. I thank NIICE and Dr. Bansal for chairing and everyone who are listening here. because recently in Afghanistan, we have a new turning point in our history, because after 4 decades of war in Afghanistan, a new squeezing of peace process has been there, that we are listening daily through media, international media, national media, and also the people of Afghanistan listening this good news are happy despite the heavy fighting in different corners of the country, different provinces and districts. But still, we hope that we have broken the taboos when 2-3 years back, there was no any hope or any news of peace process in Afghanistan. At least nowadays, we are seeing and watching through media that the government of Afghanistan, the Taliban as a belligerent, and different international players are sitting on the table and discussing the possibilities of peace process in Afghanistan. Because at least what we have seen recently in Afghanistan is that conceptually, at least, there is a consensus among the players of war in Afghanistan who have come to the conclusion that the long-term war in Afghanistan after 4 decades have reached a fatigue that if we, for some seconds, remove the asset of war in Afghanistan, or using different groups as assets by the neighboring states in Afghanistan, then we can think of a fatigue among the Taliban and among the other neutral groups who are active in Afghanistan in different parts of the country. So that is why these conflict fatigue have given a conclusion for the Afghan government, for the Taliban, for Pakistanis, and for the United States or international troops in Afghanistan, so that think of any peace possibilities in the country. That is why when the matter of peace came in between, then there was the next important topic, which was the role of a mediator who can use the advantages, the resources, and the process, so that can at least bring the confidence, trust among the players, so that a peace is possible in practice, not only in conceptions. Although we have seen some of the first or initial steps in Qatar, that the belligerent groups and the Taliban, the government of Afghanistan, they have come together. But still there was a concern among the Afghan scholars, Afghan analysts, who were very much whether Qatar is a good mediator in Afghan peace process or not, because we had many other options to define a host for Afghan peace process. Malaysia was the volunteer, Turkey was the volunteer, Russia was the volunteer, and Norway, many other countries who have the experience of hosting a peace process in different regions of the world. But what I see here in Afghanistan, and I always discuss with many think tanks and different decision-making groups, that Qatar is one of the most important mediating state in Afghan peace process, because many other countries who are volunteers for hosting Afghan peace process, or whether in the circle of players in the conflict of Afghanistan, or whether they are completely out of the region, who does not understand the language of peace and conflict in Afghanistan. So it would be a little bit difficult to leverage the peace process in Afghanistan by those countries who have been traditional host or mediator in Afghanistan, or in any other peace conflict. That is why the Turkey hosting, or the Turkey's enthusiasm towards the peace process in Afghanistan did not work. We have seen, because it is as a part of the circle, as a player. So that is why there were lack of confidence among the belligerents in Afghanistan who did not trust in Turkey. The Taliban itself, as the most important belligerents was fighting against the government of Afghanistan, did not have that trust on Turkey, and they did not listen to what Turkey was hosting in Istanbul, the peace process. So that is why we have studied on Qatar's leverages and challenges, and we were working on how these leverage will work on Afghanistan peace process and what are the challenges, so that Qatar has to take into consideration and invest on some of removing these challenges, so that at least we can reach this goal. Because for me, Qatar is a unique potential to resolve conflict in Afghanistan based on the region that they are belonging. Different capacities and potentials we have seen for Qatar in comparison with other those who are very much volunteers. And these leverages, I can at least assure that on different circles of players in Afghanistan can work, so that consensus or coherence we can have from the Qatar's potentials. For example, Qatar is a rising star in not only in West Asia, but also in our all around Asia and the larger parts of Asia, because of rising as a new branding in West Asia and playing as a neutral foreign policy, not only on its own region, Persian Gulf, but also in larger different other regions across Asia, and playing with the United States and with Europe and with China, with Russia, with India, with all these important players or big players who are very much concerned about the destiny of Asia and what are going on in, for example, a near future in Asia. Then second, a neutral player, because although it's in a very critical geopolitics, a rival geopolitics of Saudi Arabia and Iran in one side and different other contesting powers in West Asia, but Qatar has invested on neutrality because of its size, maybe as a determinism, but it at least created some of the confidence among different other states who are a little bit out of the West Asian region, so that they can trust on Qatar as a neutral player and who can join any peace process without having any direct interest for its own national interest. It's a rich nation using the oil and gas as a tools of diplomacy, as a carrot diplomacy, so that to convince any parties of war to listen to them and to at least come to a conclusion. It is a soft power, a very important soft power who is using any possibilities, any tools, so that can span its sphere of influence by that, because we can understand, for example, the role of Al Jazeera as an important tools of Qatar's soft power, who has concentrated or attracted many traditional Islamic movements around the world in West Asia towards Doha, so that sometimes even they are representing the interests of this traditional Islamic movement. And a mediator. The only branding that I can see for Qatar in West Asia comparing with any other Persian Gulf states or any other state is the mediating brand that Qatar has created for itself, taking a role in peace process in Yemen, peace process in South Sudan or Sudan, peace process in Iraq, peace process in Palestine, and different other smaller peace process operations that created a brand or a state brand for Qatar. Therefore, for this state branding peace negotiation of Qatar, Qatar has developed a model of peace process for itself as QMCC, CR, Qatar Model of Conflict Resolution, which has different unique indexes of its own. For example, how they are changing the environment through this method, or for example, changing the perceptions, or how they are creating motivations among different belligerents of a conflict so that they can reach a conclusion, or they can go through to converge different contesting interests among the parties of war in any peace process. In Afghanistan also, the QMCR is one of the most important tools by Qataris to influence the parties of war and then to bring them on the table to discuss what are the possibilities of bringing a consensus to end the conflict in Afghanistan. For example, when we are talking about the conflicts of Afghanistan, we have three circles of war who are involved somehow directly, indirectly, as an pro-action state or a reaction state. For example, in the first circle of war, we have the government of Afghanistan, we have Taliban, we have Pakistan, we have the United States of America. These four parties are in the first circle of conflict in Afghanistan. In the second circle of war in Afghanistan, we have India, we have Iran, we have Turkey, we have Russia, as the countries who are somehow vulnerable because of the conflict and rivalries in the region that we have, especially on the battleground in Afghanistan. And then we have different other smaller countries who are in the third circle, smaller not in size, but in the volume of interests or volume of the vulnerabilities that they have. For example, the EU or the Chinese, or for example, sorry, the Chinese is also in the second, the Saudi Arabia and other countries. So these are somehow involved in the conflict of Afghanistan. If we cannot bring a convergence of interest, or if we cannot build a consensus among all the parties of war in these three circles, it would be difficult to bring end to the Afghanistan conflict. That is why when I see the leveraging factors of Qatar in Afghanistan in all parties of war, I can see that Qatar has individually leveraging factors with all these parties of war in the first circle, second circle, and third circle. For example, you can see how Qatar is using the soft power, using the economic power, using the neutrality, or using, for example, the mediating factor towards the government of Afghanistan, towards Taliban, towards Pakistan, towards India, towards Iran or Saudi Arabia, China, United States of America, and EU. You can see different individual factors between Doha and any other capitals who are involved in the war in Afghanistan. For example, though the Qataris are having a cordial relations with the government of Afghanistan after the collapse of Taliban for the development of the country, supporting the government of Afghanistan on different ways, at the same time they are attracting Talibans and hosting Talibans in Doha. Even sometimes they are taking some parts in the economic sectors for Taliban, and even some of the Taliban leadership, they have a very safe closet in Doha. Even sometimes there are evidence that they have married the Qataris women, and they have a very safe place for themselves. Sometimes Al Jazeera can be also speaker for Taliban operations and for Taliban propaganda. So the same way with Pakistan is the same way with the US, because of the Al Hadid security bases and many other factors that I cannot go in details with this 10 to 12 minutes, but I have written an article. I'm sure that I can share with you later, and you can see what are the details and how these leveraging factors work for at least to convince or to be convinced by Qataris so that a convergence of interest is possible in Afghan peace process. But despite that, of course, there are many shortcomings also in Qatari model of peace and conflict resolution, because Qatar has the long experience in different parts of the world, especially in the West Asian region, in the Middle East. But Afghanistan is a little bit different because we are at the edge of West Asia. We are into Central Asia, we are into South Asia, and even some parts of the country is completely involved with East Asian, Kashgar, Xinjiang, and other parts of the East Asian region. So a country being in the crossroads of 4 regions and shadowed by the security systems of the region, security systems of the international organizations like Shanghai and NATO, is little bit a unique, having a unique position which cannot be easily go through the QMCR model of a peace and conflict resolution. For example, the Qatari QMCR is very much weak in follow-up because we have seen the experiences of Qatar in Yemen, experiences of Qatar in Palestine, even in Iraq and in Northern Africa, that they have a big follow-up of at least achieving some of the minor steps or small steps to reach the overall goals. Then they have the no root causes crisis management. Qataris are very much busy in surfaces of the conflict in different societies. But for this model of conflict resolution, we have seen very weak position of going into the deep root of the conflicts. For example, what are the challenges inside the society, how the regional powers are involved in a conflict, what are the assets, what are the military strategies, especially what are the proxies in a conflict, so that taking that considerations, then there would be at least a resolution. Then the Wasata. Wasata is also a very important index of Qatari model of conflict resolution. It's a traditional one. They will go into the very mediation parts of the elites or the leadership in a country. But if you go to the significances of the parties, or for example, the natures of parties, it would be little difficult to resolve a conflict by the Wasata method or by the mediating method, which is a failure in Yemen, which is a failure in Iraq and in Palestine. Of course, following the same method in Afghanistan also will be a shortcomings of QMCR that we have seen. No stick but carrot is also an important shortcomings of the QMCR, because Qataris are always using their leverage of carrots or economy to at least convince some of the parties of war so that they can be convinced on some of the interests, which does not work always, because if you always give carrots to the parties of war, of course, the continuation of the war will be possible, because all the leadership, they will be trying somehow to take more and more carrots and to use the opportunity and to strengthen or to extend the war process. So that is why if Qataris are not using with some of the strategic partners, United States, India, or other countries, as a pressure or as a stake, it would be little difficult to take the objective or reach the conclusion. And at the end, no focus on socio-political fabrics, because We will have maybe the significance of conflict different in Yemen and other countries, but when we come to Afghanistan, it would be a little difficult because the social fabrics are completely different, and that is what we have some of the main factors of, or the main causes of war through this social fabric. So it needs more studies and reach a conclusion. I will stop here, Dr. Bansal. I'm sure I'm not crossed my limit, but if there are questions, of course, I'll respond. Thank you very much.
We'll be taking questions at the end after all speakers have done. There are already certain questions which are coming. Most of these questions will relate to Afghan peace process rather than Qatar's role in it, but we would definitely come. I'll now request Dr. Victoria to now start. I have already introduced her, and I'm sorry for holding you back after introducing you. Over to you, Dr. Victoria.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bansal. This is a real pleasure for me to be part of this very distinguished conference. Unfortunately, we are not meeting offline, face-to-face. Of course, the pandemic that came to us last year, early last year, or late 19, it's been on the one hand a real challenge, and I will be rather also discussing more general trends of what this conference is about. But interestingly, what Mr. Balkhi was talking about Qatar's role, not always very clear from the very start, right, to find it among primary actors in the neighborhood. But it is clearly, and I would agree, one of the important actors. And if you remember SPIEF, St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, earlier this month, we had Qatar, Emir of Qatar, as one of their key guests, and he's been part of the plenary with Vladimir Putin and Prime Minister Kurz of Austria. And they also have, our leaders also have permanent discussions between them. And of course, Russia recognizes the role of Qatar, among other countries, in Greater Eurasia or in Asia. One disclaimer, I'd like to say that I will be speaking only in my personal capacity, not in any case as a vice president or any other realm. So please do not take those as any official position. So there are several general trends I'd like to outline, which are important in my regard, in my view, for the development of conflict areas here, or rather developing solutions to overcome conflicts in the area and to provide for sustainable, peaceful and prosperous development of South Asia, West Asia and Eurasia as a whole. These regions have become ever more important with the shift of governance, global governance, with a shift of power, both economic and political, to Asia. It's no longer, just 5 years ago, it's been kind of not a contested, but rather discussing point that there is still, this was still an emerging powerhouse. But today we no longer doubt that Asia has become their key point and key powerhouse of global development. And that is why it is important for all the countries, for all the actors that are involved, they are part of this neighborhood and that part of Asia or Eurasia, engage together into cooperative behavior in order to provide for their own development, but in order to provide for global peaceful evolution. Why I say that is that it's become even more evident with the advent of pandemic. It was seeming initially that we would be having with this global kind of tragic endeavor, we would come up together, all the countries. This would be like an external threat for all of us, where we would be able to come to terms and forget some of the divergences that our countries have. Unfortunately, instead, this brought us to a rise of national egoisms on the part of quite a few actors, and to their acuteness of the problems that were even dormant before, and a bigger acuteness of the problems that were also on their top of the agenda previously. And that is why I think one of the main trends and one of the issues we need to, all of us need to look at more importantly, is their amount of initiatives that are directed from different actors towards this particular area, towards this region, and to see how much those are complementing. We need to ensure that those projects are not in order to kind of leave some of the actors behind, but to provide for big advantages for the other actors. But BRI, Greater Eurasian Partnership, their Indian, but not only Indian, this is also general approach to North-South corridor, some other like Turkish initiatives, that they are brought together and complementing each other for their joint benefit. And this is important. And this is not something we are always witnessing, at least not on the part of all the actors that are having those big geopolitical, geoeconomic projects. Another issue I'd like to raise is that this pandemic have brought all of us, and it's influencing directly each and every conflict. It's brought the weaknesses of our existence, not only healthcare systems, but of the systems of providing for human development and social development. And what we see is that what was earlier just hard security, and where we were looking only and employing methods for hard security, now things that are important here for humanitarian cooperation, for humanitarian survival, they very often put on the agenda for politicization. And that is why I'm talking about the approaches of some countries to vaccines, vaccine diplomacy. We have this new term, and earlier this was more general medical diplomacy. So this is another area where we will not be able to survive, each of us on our own. And we each are living, even before the session, there were questions on, for example, how India is surviving this third wave. I think all of our countries are having another surge in rise of pandemics, and we are many countries are living in their situation when there is not enough of capacity, production capacity for those, and thus, in order for us to overcome this problem, we cannot be centering and just keeping ensuring only around our own proper place and only relying on our forces. So I think this is another very important point we need to consider. Another thing is that we are also in the situation when the pandemic have exacerbated all the existing challenges. We need to be working very closely within international organizations, multilateral organizations, in order to provide for Afghanistan when in the situation when American forces are being pulled out, although there are some that are left. And obviously it is important, as previous speaker have been speaking, to involve other actors that are not in the first or second circle of involvement. But there are also other conflict, hotspots that need to be solved. like bilateral conflict that happened on the border between the two giants of Eurasia. And this is where we need to employ not dividing forces, but multilateral approach, and all the possible platforms like Shanghai Cooperation Organization or CSTO or RIC or other existing platforms. This is extremely important that no one is left behind. Another area, another trend that I'd like to draw our attention is that in such a situation, we need to offer further opportunities for the neighborhood and for the region to develop properly. We need to consider joint projects in area of economics, in area of logistics. And that is why also very much politicized transport corridors. There has to be an assessment of their relevance for the countries, for the development of Eurasia as a whole, and then probably putting more efforts in employing not only national resources, but also such banks like AIIB or NDB, New Development Bank of BRICS, that could be employed for evaluation and for further development of those projects. Another thing is that there is still remains to be a divergence between, or let's say different approaches between established economies and emerging economies in the official development assistance and assistance to developing countries and Eurasian countries, countries of South Asia, West Asia. Of course, I'm among those who are the most among the interessants of such aid. And thus, we also need to not to provide for competitiveness, right? But rather for mutual consideration of interests in this realm. Because we see that with the pandemic, levels of poverty have risen. It's by now, we are not likely to achieve goals that were set in SDG 2030 by the established time. It was already quite not clear even before the pandemic, but pandemic have brought it even to a bigger problematic spot. And it is likely that by the end of this year, we are to have 150 million people in extreme poverty more. And a large portion of that is to be attributed to this region. That is why, but also Africa. That is why we really need to consider the role in cooperation between main powerhouses of Eurasia. And that is why I strongly support and think greater Eurasian partnership that is promoted by Russian Federation could be employed as such an idea to kind of to be uniting the existing projects and to be offering a general overview that would be a win-win situation. And it is extremely important, not because zero-sum game would be bringing chaos and poverty to the countries, the smaller countries of the region. And we should be thinking about general prosperity. And last but not the least, I believe that with their rising, another issue would be climate change. On the one hand, we had pandemic as there probably more people were sitting at homes, lockdowns, and there were less pollution. But on the other hand, we saw that this didn't solve some of the problems, it rather exacerbated them. And South Asia, West Asia are among their countries that are feeling the consequences of climate change. And I think this is another area where we need to be talking and not only on the terms that are offered by advanced economies, but also on the terms that would be considering our own positions, each of our countries' positions, but also once again on multilateral level. There is no alternative to diplomatic means, to negotiations, and no alternative to United Nations as a bigger platform, but also to the regional platforms of which I've been talking during my speech. I will stop here, but I will be ready to respond to questions, and probably more ideas would come up when other speakers talk. Thank you so much, Mr. Bansal.
Thank you, Dr. Victoria. I'm sure there'll be questions on Eurasian partnership as well as North-South corridor when we come to the question and answer session. We move to our next speaker, Dr. Dan Schueftan. He's from university. He's the Director of National Security Studies Center at the University of Haifa and senior lecturer at the School of Political Science and Israeli Defense Forces National Defense College. He was visiting professor at Georgetown University in US, and he has been briefing ministers, senior officers, defense and intelligence officials, including the Israel's Prime Minister's office, as well as Foreign Minister, Defense Ministry, and National Security Council, as well as to the US Senate and House of Representatives. He has authored A Jordanian Option, Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinians. Attrition, Egypt's post-war political strategy, 1967 to 70. Disengagement, Israel and the Palestinian entity. Palestinians in Israel, the Arab minority and the Jewish state, and others. So without wasting much time, I'll request him to now take the floor. Over to Dr. Dan.
Thank you. Let me speak about changes in the Middle East, and for a change, positive changes. We are not used to hear positive news from the Middle East. And by the way, when it is positive news to some people in the Middle East, it is negative news to others in the Middle East. So let's at least discuss something that for some parties of the Middle East are also positive. We are witnessing recently a fundamental change in the regional architecture in the region. We are having the same problem we always had. I'm speaking about decades, I'm speaking about generations. But we have, for a change, a response that is somewhat more positive than what we've seen in the past. Let me start with the problem. The problem is radicalism in Muslim majority countries. And let me be very clear here, this is not necessarily religious Muslim radicalism, namely not necessarily Islamism, but what we've seen in this region for a very long time, namely elements that are radical, and they manage to disrupt other considerations of other countries who are not radical by imposing the radical way on countries that are not interested in having this as their way. And what we see now is some positive change where the radicals are being isolated and the elements that are interested more in stability are gaining strength. Let me first explain what the source of this radicalism in the region is. We see a major, unbridgeable gap between the perception of people in the region of the world as it is and the world as it should have been. They have this perception, and I can understand it with the glorious past of Islam and of Arabs, that Arabs are destined for greatness. They've had a past of greatness, and they expect greatness to visit them again. They expect to be leading elements in the world. They speak about it very, very often, but they recognize, realistically, I must say, they recognize that at the moment, they are not only in a very, very deep crisis that we are seeing for more than 100 years in the region, but recently, even a perception of hopelessness. Namely, not only the situation today is very, very bad, but it will always, not always, but probably in the near future, be not much better. And at the moment, we see very little hope in most of the countries of the Middle East, with a few exceptions that I will mention in a moment, of radicals who are trying to offer this kind of hope, but others are no longer buying. Now, what is the reason that we have this enormous gap between the expectations and the performance, between what people believe they should have and what they recognize that they don't have? I think the major reason is that for the last 100 years, particularly in Arab states, we have seen very, very little, if any, kind of nation building, society building. If you look at the Arab states since the beginning of the period where they became partially independent and then totally independent, we've seen very little progress in terms of adjusting the society to the challenges of the 20th century and later the 21st century. And we have, as a result, as an inevitable result, we have a region that is structurally violent and unstable, not only in the region itself. When you take a very large number of Arabs who fled the region, went to Europe, established Arab communities in Europe, they are not integrating in the European society, and they brought with them a culture, again, of violence and instability. Not all of them, but the important thing is that the minority of violent and radical elements are dictating to a very large extent the behavior of communities that are not essentially violent and unstable. But this is something that you can see in the region, and you can see beyond the region when you speak about Arab political culture. And therefore, there is an understanding, there is a deep understanding that Arabs have failed in gaining the position in the world that they believe they deserve. And if until a decade ago, there was still a hope that you can depose the regimes who produce this backwardness and substitute them with regimes that will catapult the Arabs to the position they believe they deserve, what we have seen in the last decade, what is sometimes called the Arab Spring, is that the opposite is happening. Namely, that you have an understanding that when the society replaces the regimes, the result is either not better or sometimes worse than before. Take what happened in Syria, take what happened in Egypt, take what happened in a number of Arab states where changing the regime or changing the people on top did not produce a better situation. In Libya, for instance, it produced a situation even worse than under the dictatorship of Gaddafi. And there is the understanding that this is a perpetual failure, or at least for the immediate future, you don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And against this background, you had radical regimes, Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, the regime of the Assad family in Syria, the Iranian revolution since 79, ISIS, the Muslim brothers throughout the region, who offer radical approaches. Some of them have already failed. Some of them, in my view, are in a process of failing. But the important thing is that until recently, the radicals managed to coerce the non-radicals to follow in their footsteps. So non-radical Arab states who did not want to pay the price of radicalism had to do it because they were afraid that if they don't do it, they will be toppled by their own people. And here is the change that we see in recent years. We see Arab states, we don't see it on the level of the Arab society at the moment, but on the political level, we see Arab states who understand that the Arabs are today so weak that they can be taken over by the Iranians and to a lesser extent by the Turks. They are frightened, and should be frightened, of the Iranian ambitions of regional hegemony. And they say to themselves, we can no longer pretend to be radical and to work with the radicals, because if we don't defend ourselves, we will be taken over by the radicals. And you have in the region different kinds of radicalism. You have Shiite radicalism that is represented primarily with the Iranian revolutionary regime, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon. And you have also Sunni radicalism that is expressed in Turkey, in the Muslim Brothers, in ISIS. And the change, the dramatic change is that most Arab states recently came to the conclusion that only Israel is strong enough to fight this radicalism. And because the Israelis are not only powerful enough to do it, but also have the motivation to do it for their own good, not to do it because the Arabs have asked them to do it. But a byproduct of it will be that the Arabs can rely on the Israeli strengths in order to defend themselves against the threat of particularly Iranian takeover and hegemony, but also to a lesser extent in a more limited part of the region of the Turkish one. And now what we have is a fascinating coalition. We used to speak about the Middle East in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And you have the Arabs, every Arab on the one hand, and Israel on the other. What we're having today is a coalition of Israel with not only most of the Arab states, but also with the most important Arab states, and I mean primarily Saudi Arabia and Egypt, but also countries in the Gulf, Jordan, Morocco, and many others. You have a coalition of Israel and most Arabs against the radicalism of the Iranians on the one hand, and the Turks, again, to a much lesser extent, on the other. So it is not the Arab-Israeli conflict that is the defining element in the region, and certainly not this hallucination that if you do something with the Palestinians, the Middle East will be stabilized. This is something that very few still believe, but also not the Shiite-Sunni difference, because if you look, for instance, at the cooperation between the Shiite Iranians and the Sunni Muslim Brothers in the Gaza Strip, you see that this is not the dividing line. And the problem, the most important problem, and here this is the last element that I want to mention and then focus on it for a short while, is that at the moment we have no American leadership, because if you have American leadership to this Israeli-Arab coalition against Iran, then we would be in very good shape. But under Obama, we had this hallucination of Obama that you can stabilize the Middle East by basically appeasing the radicals, particularly Turkey and Iran. And again, this particular regime in Iran, this particular regime in Turkey, and bring about a Palestinian-Israeli peace, and this will stabilize the region. Now, this failed. Practically everything that Obama did in the region completely failed. And not only did it fail in what it wanted to achieve, it also brought Iranian control over Iraq, Turkish control in Syria, and Russian involvement in the Middle East because of a profound misunderstanding of the region. Now, you had such American mistakes in the past. Eisenhower in 1956 is a very good example, but Eisenhower understood that he was mistaken, changed his policies, and the Eisenhower doctrine went in the opposite direction. Obama did not understand it, but what we have now, after Trump went in an opposite direction, the most important question is now, what will Biden do? And interestingly enough, Biden is following in the footsteps of Obama when it comes to Iran, but he is beginning to understand that if the United States wants to leave the Middle East, and it should leave the Middle East in order to focus on Asia, in order to pivot to Asia, then it must leave behind it this coalition that is interested in the same national interests of the United States, namely the combination primarily of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt with most Arab states. And the Americans are beginning to understand that if they want to leave the Middle East and then not to be sucked again into the region, they must reconsider going as far as they intended to go on the Iranian issue. Let me end by quoting Winston Churchill, and I think in a very appropriate way concerning the situation that we are facing now. He is reported to have said, "America eventually does the right thing, not before the Americans have exhausted all other options." I think that this will be true in this instance as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Da. Very interesting subject and lot of issues. I found especially the omission of Al-Qaeda from Sunni extremist list rather amusing. Either you have written a premature obituary for Ayman al-Jawahiri and his gang, or probably you don't consider them extremist. We'll come to this probably in question and answer session. Our next speaker is Dr. Vishal Chandra. He's a research fellow at Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. He specializes in the politics of Afghan conflict and war. He has traveled widely in Afghanistan and has participated in numerous seminars, etc. He's also written extensively for newspapers, etc. So without wasting much time, I will now request my former colleague, Dr. Vishal Chandra, to take. Please stick to 10 to 12 minutes. Vishal.
Thank you, Chair. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Pramod, for giving me this opportunity to share my personal views, observations about the evolving situation in Afghanistan. Well, since I'm supposed to stick to the time allotted to me, what I'm going to do, I'm going to make some broad observations, and perhaps more could be discussed during the Q&A session. And I would appreciate if the chair could let me know when I'm left with just 1 minute so that I can make all my points within 8 to 9 minutes. Well, Afghanistan has come full circle, and one could clearly see some of the old trends of the conflict emerging, not only within Afghanistan, but around Afghanistan as well. We often hear that it is very important to protect the gains that Afghanistan has made over the last 2 decades. And several figures and facts are usually cited, but I think at a time when there's hardly any peace process or hardly any development has been made as far as the Doha talks are concerned, I think it is very important to look back a little into the history to be able to understand what could be the way forward. I think that's the best way to try and understand what could be the way forward in the current circumstances. I think it is very important, though no one talks about bond process anymore, but I think since I'm looking back into history, I think it is very important to understand 2 very major achievements that Afghanistan had made post-2001. I think, and that were 2 very important achievements of the bond process. Number 1 was the role it played in terms of civilizing the role of the various groups within Afghanistan, the militia groups in Afghanistan, and we have to look at these achievements in sharp contrast to what was happening in Afghanistan before 2001, during the 90s. Second major development was the introduction of a new constitution. Now the political system, of course, there were problems, there were shortcomings, there were serious issues as far as the bond process or its outcomes are concerned, or the constitution is concerned. But nevertheless, I think in the given circumstances, the fact that bond process was pretty successful in terms of civilizing the role of the militia groups, was pretty successful in bringing in a constitution which reflected the post-90s social and political realities of Afghanistan, the diversity of Afghanistan. I think that has to be kept in mind if one is looking at probable future scenarios. Because I, for one, find it very difficult, logically difficult, to think of a political arrangement or a political setup which could accommodate the diversity that defines Afghanistan. And I'm talking of the different political interests that groups have in Afghanistan, often mutually exclusive. So if a system or a constitution or constitutional order which confers equal rights to all citizens of the country, irrespective of their gender, their ethnic, linguistic, or sectarian identities, I think it's worth protecting that system and worth protecting the constitutional order that defines that system. Now, I don't think that a serious peace process started in Afghanistan. What we have seen September, after the signing of the US-Taliban agreement on February 29 last year, and the talks that began a couple of months later in September 2020, I don't think serious negotiations have taken place. What we have seen last couple of months are interactions, formal or informal interactions. These are talks, but no negotiations have taken place so far. But if one tries to take a little nuanced view of an agreement that was signed between a reigning superpower and a terrorist network, seeking security guarantees, and this is where I'd like to bring in some regional countries who too seem to have bought the idea of engaging Taliban to seek guarantees, security guarantees from them. I think it is very important to understand that if one were to take a dispassionate view of the US-Taliban agreement and what followed thereafter. Now, this agreement somewhere which was signed, keeping the elected Afghan government out of the whole 1.5 year or 2 year process, has successfully helped Pakistan in terms of diverting the international attention from the role that it plays inside Afghanistan. Pakistan has successfully moved into the role of a benign facilitator while continuing to support Taliban. And at the same time, it has helped Taliban to keep their, the younger generation of fighters engaged, lest they feel disillusioned about the whole idea of establishing an emirate, or they start questioning the leadership. But at the same time, advertently or inadvertently, these are my personal takes, the US-Taliban agreement or the talks that followed may have helped in terms of, if one tries to take a little nuanced view, may have helped in terms of identifying groups within the Taliban who have come to understand the value of diplomacy. Though I would not suggest that there is any shift as far as the ideology of Taliban is concerned. There is no shift if one looks at the ground situation in Afghanistan or the way they are conducting themselves in area that they control. They do not seem to be positioning themselves either for a genuine intra-Afghan dialogue or a sustainable nationwide ceasefire, which in my view is very critical to creating a conducive atmosphere for making progress in any peace talks or any peace process, or even for people to have faith in such a peace process. Now, Taliban clearly seek the return of what was taken away from them in 2001, which is their emirate, and they still seek to impose their ideology, and that explains, the targeted attacks against anything that defines the post-2001 political process. And they have not spared schools, hospitals, mosques, even the critical infrastructure. So they completely want to undo what has been achieved since 2001 process. If there has been any change as far as Taliban is concerned, then their communications strategy has undergone a change in terms of public outreach through various fora, including social media, or their diplomatic outreach as and when the opportunity came their way. They are relatively more sensitized to the kind of audience they are addressing, or have a more differentiated approach whereby they put on a moderate face or relatively benign, ready to reconcile phase where when interacting with a wider regional or international or especially the Western audience. They have been capitalizing on the number of platforms or increased interactions they now have at the broader regional and extra-regional levels to secure the much needed legitimacy. And we all are aware that international legitimacy was a very frustrating factor for the Taliban regime back in 90s. Now, again, this is just an assumption if one were to look at the prospects of dialogue among various groups in Afghanistan. One would have to make certain assumptions. And I think what certain countries or United States and other countries other than Pakistan could possibly be looking at is a possible generational gap that might have crept in over the last 2 decades. Now, a section of older leadership may have realized the value of diplomacy, may have realized the necessity of international legitimacy, which may not be possible until they agree to be part of a broader, inclusive political setup. But convincing the younger generation of fighters, the more uncompromising sections of Taliban is something that's going to be very difficult. But nevertheless, as they expand their control, definitely the element of competition will widen in the months to come, as various groups within the Taliban, especially the military shoot of the Taliban, may not be keen on opening dialogue or entering into any partial area agreement or a dialogue at a time when the Western forces are about to complete their withdrawal. Now, I do not really see any way forward unless the pro-talks group is able to move away and engages in serious negotiations. So I think if it is logically difficult or rather impossible to think of a stable or a peaceful Afghanistan anytime soon, then going by the same logic, one can suggest that Afghans need to find ways to protect their national flag and constitution. And it is logical to suggest that Afghans need to put up a united front. Very quickly, as far as India is concerned, well, I think as a key stakeholder and partner in the stability and development of post-2001 Afghanistan, and as the Western forces withdraw their military assets, I think India is taking a very nuanced and a comprehensive view of the emerging security scenario. And in this regard, India, in my view, is willing to contribute to any regional or international initiative that seeks to facilitate a broad-based, inclusive, and sustainable peace process, one that is sensitive to the aspirations of the Afghan people. Thank you.
Vishal, interesting issues. I think we will have a lot of questions on this Afghan peace process and how a terrorist outfit has been legitimized by negotiations by a superpower. But our final speaker is Dr. Anna A. Velikaya, who's a lecturer at the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration. She is the co-editor and author of Russia's Public Diplomacy. She has been the spokesperson for the Russian delegation to International Military Sports Council. She's also been working at Goshko Public Diplomacy Foundation and Mirwais. She's an member of the Expert Council of Rostrudnishstvo Federal Agency. Her recent publications include comparative aspects of Russian and US public diplomacy in Middle East and Soviet public diplomacy. Now, without wasting much time, over to Dr. Anna, please.
Dear colleagues, hello. I'd like to share my vision of Russian public diplomacy in Central Asia, and thanks to NIICE for this opportunity. It's my already third conference. My first conference with NIICE was 1 year ago when I was 2 months pregnant. Now the baby is already 4 months old. So we're growing together with NIICE, and thanks a lot for this great opportunity and for these greatest speakers. It's a great honor for me. And as for Russian public diplomacy in Central Central Asia, we should admit that the region is notorious with the huge cultural and scientific heritage and on the huge influence it has had on both Europe and Asia in medieval times. So all 5 states remember about its medieval greatness, but unfortunately today the region is facing various problems from the big development of micro institutions to the water supply problems, and also although the region is very rich with the natural resources and it's situated at the crossroads of both east-west and north-south trade routes, now it demonstrates various problems, and at the same time countries, all 5 countries are trying to brand themselves as having multi-vector diplomacy and as platforms of negotiations. We all maybe remember 1966 Tashkent Declaration between India and Pakistan. Now Kazakhstan is trying to introduce its Syria negotiation track, or even in Turkmenistan there is UN Preventive Diplomacy Center. So countries of the region are trying to demonstrate as themselves as having multi-vector diplomacy. As for Russian presence in the region, it has started during the Russian imperial times, and we also have Soviet legacy, although it's rather positive. For example, all infrastructural projects, all education reforms, women empowerment, all go back to this period. But at the same time, these countries having the majority of which have authoritarian regimes, people in these countries sometimes blame Russia for giving such legacy, and now although they cannot change the situation, there is always someone to be blamed, and so sometimes Russia is to be blamed for both imperial and Soviet period and for its current foreign policy. As for the Eurasian region, it's for sure for the top priority for Russian foreign policy concerns, and all 5 countries of the region participate in the integration projects together with Russia. All 5 countries participate in the Commonwealth of Independent States, 2 countries participate in the Eurasian Economic Union, 3 countries participate in the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and 4 countries participate in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. About 5 years ago, Russia has introduced the Great Eurasia, a strategy promoted by President Putin on the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. And also countries of the region can participate in the North-South Transport Corridor. Also, Russia introduces its economic initiatives in the region, as it was said recently by the MFA representative. The total volume of Russian accumulated investments in the Central Asian region nears $50 billion US. To promote its public diplomacy in the region, Russia has introduced Central Asia-oriented structures, the majority of which are state-supported. At the same time, Russia is trying to introduce civil diplomacy initiatives, sub-state diplomacy initiatives, like, for example, during COVID times, some Russian Turkic-speaking regions were providing humanitarian aid to Central Asian country based on their own shared Turkic identity. But still civil society engagement is too limited, and the majority of the initiatives are all state supported, and that's for sure the huge problem for Russian public diplomacy in the region. As far as we remember, it's the region of the top priority for its foreign policy goals, but unfortunately the most amount of the initiatives is based on some common past, but it's not introducing some shared vision of the also some new agenda. For example, I would say that the great amount of initiatives goes back to the Great Patriotic War, to the common participation in the World War II, but to attract the modern population and young people, it's not enough. You have to offer some new agenda. Also, Russia is presented in the region through its development assistance mechanisms. Russia spends annually around $120 million on these initiatives, and the most amount of it goes to the Eurasian region. But the problem is this aid is not branded like it's from Russia with love. It usually goes through UN mechanisms, so it's not target-oriented, and recipients of this aid, they don't know that it comes from Russia. 6 years ago, Russia has established Russia UNDP Trust Fund. The majority of its efforts are focused on the Central Asia countries, but for surely that's not enough, as still the vast amount of aid goes through UN mechanisms. Also, the pandemic highlights the situation when it's important to cooperate on state level, on civil society level, and it introduces shifts in public diplomacy practices. And Russia gives aid to all 5 Central Asian states, but the problem is it's not widely media covered. And sometimes for Russia in the region, it's better to be good rather than to be rich or strong than to be perceived. So sometimes mechanisms are public diplomacy efforts underline common vision or some common past or Russian greatness, but sometimes it's better to offer some target-oriented solution. And as for the COVID situation, Russian Sputnik V vaccine is produced in Kazakhstan, but recently Kazakhstan has, several days ago, Kazakhstan has introduced its new own vaccine. Sorry, just a second. And also, it's necessary to underline that Central Asian migrants are working in Russia, millions of people, so it could be a huge public diplomacy asset, but unfortunately Russia does not use this mechanism actively, and so it could be used to introduce public diplomacy when working with these people while they're staying in Russia, while they are sending millions of dollars to their home countries, but this mechanism is not used in Russia actively. Also, scientific diplomacy could be part of Russian public diplomacy in the region. Recently, MGIMO has opened its new branch in Tashkent, and at the same time, the issue of joint MA programs, financing of field research, and grants for young scientists, and the involvement of foreigners in the systematic project work are still on the agenda. As for public diplomacy efforts in the region of other states, here we should remember that Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, USA, China, India, Japan are all introducing its own interests and are all implementing various successful public diplomacy projects. And when working with the young population, we should remember that it's necessary to be attractive, to introduce new projects. Sometimes Russian public diplomacy efforts are based on the common history, on culture, on the common cultural heritage. But here we should think about introducing new projects, because public diplomacy in this region is very competitive. There are a lot of actors working in this sphere, and we should try to be successful, attractive, and introduce new formats. Thanks a lot. I will be glad to answer during Q&A session.
Thank you, Dr. Rana. That's wonderful. We have managed to complete it in time. And we have a few questions, which I'll read it out from the chat box, and then raise some questions and then go back to all the panelists in the reverse order in which we started to have a more democratic functioning. We went in a particular order, and we will allow the panelists to answer in the reverse order. Some of the questions that have been posted on the chat box is from Meena Ajay. What is the nature of the Afghan insurgency, and what type of political accommodation, if any, can be negotiated with the insurgents? I'll read all the questions and then we'll go to the panelists one by one. Then there is another question from Mr. Binod Khanda. Is there any possibility to get a peace process model from Nepal in Afghanistan? As you know, Nepal had a peace process whereby Maoist insurgency was curtailed. They were incorporated into the government. There was a peace process and elections held and all those issues. So we will go, I'll start with Dr. Anna, and I have a question for you because none of these chat box questions are. Firstly, how has Russian public diplomacy, you talked of various issues, how has Russian public diplomacy been useful as far as controlling the bilateral issues between Central Asian republics? Many of them have many bilateral issues, which are, of course, a legacy of the Soviet era. You have enclaves within each other's territory. There have been certain territorial disputes. And associated with this is also the issue of how Russia has contributed to controlling the radicalization in these particular countries. And has the withdrawal of ethnic Russians from Central Asian republics, because the Russian population, ethnic Russian population has reduced in these Central Asian republics post-91, has it reduced Russia's influence in these countries? So this is questions. We start with you and then I'll go back in the reverse orders.
Thanks a lot, dear Dr. Bansal. I think that one of the greatest Russian public diplomacy assets in the region is Russian language, because still people in the region, when talking to each other, they are speaking Russian language. And that's one of the great initiatives, that's the greatest asset, and Russia uses it. And it introduces various projects for teachers in distinct schools in rural areas, and for university professors who are teaching Russian language. And as for radicalization, unfortunately, I think much more could be done, because extremism is the threat both for Russia and for the countries of the region. But all these initiatives go through the Collective Security Treaty Organization and through its format where 4 Central Asian countries participate. And as for the ethnic Russians, unfortunately, yeah, me myself, I come from Omsk, so it borders Kazakhstan. And I know that in 1990s, very lots of Russians, engineers, doctors came back from these Central Asian states. Unfortunately, after the crash of Soviet Union, there were terrible conditions for them, as it was the hazard for their lives staying there. And for sure, it influences rather negatively Russian relations with these countries, because these so-called Russian compatriots, they could be like goodwill ambassadors of Russia in these states. And now when these people came back to Russia, they cannot, they now become more goodwill ambassadors of these Central Asian states where they were educated and where they were working. And unfortunately, if there were more Russians in Central Asia, I think it would be more win-win situation for both Russia and for Central Asian states. But what we have now, that there are still Russians living there, we should not propose some public diplomacy projects oriented only towards them, but we should try to create some public diplomacy platforms that would guarantee these people to, for example, to share history or some foreign policy agenda of these countries together with Russia. There are still Russian origin scholars, engineers in these countries, and it could be used more actively by Russia. So thanks a lot for mentioning this fact. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Our next panelist, Dr. Vishal Chandra, you have some questions related to Afghanistan, but besides that, I have two questions for you. One is, despite all these peace talks that have been going on for quite some time and peace talks have been concluded or negotiations are going on, the violence has not come down. And the second is, how do you see this post-US withdrawal Afghan government, and what will be the impact on women, ethnic and religious minorities? Over to you. You are muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Let me begin with the question that someone raised from the audience. The nature of insurgency. Well, it's an externally sponsored insurgency. If you look at, it is sponsored from across the Durand line from Pakistan. And if you look at the structure of the Taliban, the way it has evolved post 2001, you know, after it was overthrown by the US-led Operation Enduring Freedom after the 9/11 attacks. The leadership council all these years has been based in Quetta. The Rehber Shura, the leadership council, it operates out of Quetta in Balochistan. And they have several other shuras, the Peshawar Shura. And so they have been operating out of Pakistan from across the Durand line. So it is an externally sponsored insurgency to begin with. Despite the signing of the US-Taliban agreement in February 2020 and this whole facade of having a peace process, no substantive issue has, to the best of my understanding, no substantive issue has been discussed between the Taliban representatives based in Doha, Qatar, and the Afghan government representatives, because Taliban are not seeking a political settlement or a resolution of the conflict. Resolution would be a strong word here. Let's talk about the settlement. They haven't really positioned themselves, as I brought out in my presentation. They have for long been looking at a post-West scenario, and given the the attention that they are enjoying at the wider level, because regional countries have engaged them, they do not really have, the kind of logic that is required, reasons to take these talks very seriously. Because as I said, they're looking at a post-West scenario where they can capture, and this is precisely what they're doing. They're capturing territories, they're capturing district centers, highways, link roads. Basically, Afghanistan, to an extent, the Afghanistan of 2021 resembles the Afghanistan of post-Soviet withdrawal Afghanistan, post 88, 89 or early 90s, when President Najibullah's government and the Afghan army at that point of time was struggling to retain control over provincial headquarters, struggling to control highways that connected Kabul to the provincial capitals, to the provincial headquarters. So it's a similar situation, security situation that we are seeing, the security challenge we are seeing in Afghanistan. And Taliban are not short of finances. Since they have areas or districts under their control, so they impose taxes, they collect taxes, they run their own courts, they're making revenue from the trade that takes place through those areas. Then there's a lot of smuggling going around. There are mines in areas that they control, some old mines, and they do collect revenue or impose taxes on whatever is produced of those mines. Then I didn't raise the issue of the drug trafficking from Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is still the largest supplier of illicit opium. And so this whole conflict that we are seeing in parts of Afghanistan, it's not just about capturing political power or extending control as Western forces pull out, it's also about controlling the drug trade, the routes through which the drug moves out of Afghanistan. And the Afghan drug network is very much connected to the international drug network. So it's not just about controlling those areas. There is an illegal economy which has emerged over the decades in Afghanistan. So there are different reasons as to what is sustaining this insurgency, apart from the fact that government has a limited reach in parts of Afghanistan. Now to the second question regarding violence in Afghanistan. Well, I've already explained the problem here, because Taliban are seeking the return of the emirate. There is no fundamental shift as far as their strategies they might have adapted, to the challenges. They might have, changed their strategy as part of their effort to adapt to the changing environment over the years. But there is no fundamental shift as far as their ideology is concerned. It would be too naive to think that if you bring in some Taliban, the orientation of the Taliban will change. They have no reasons to change, and they don't have the capability to change also. So what these peace efforts, so-called peace efforts, are about is to somehow get sections of Taliban, and it's an old story. Attempts were made earlier as well. So to get them into some sort of a political setup, to try and bring them into the political process, and that should strengthen the space that Afghanistan needs to continue to rebuild its structures. Now, Afghan army has taken a huge toll, and this is where the international community really needs to keep up its engagement. And regional countries, since they're directly affected by the lack of security in Afghanistan, because there's a lot of foreign terrorists have moved into Afghanistan 2014 onwards, particularly since Pakistan conducted military operations in tribal areas right next to the eastern provinces, southern eastern provinces of Afghanistan. So the violence, since the rare support base that Taliban enjoy, it's easy for them to sustain violence. Thank you. I think I've answered the question.
Yeah. Next is Dr. Dan. I think just one or two questions I just wanted to ask you is, one is, of course, I raised the issue because in the list of your Sunni radical outfits, you omitted both Al-Qaeda as well as Hamas. Was it deliberate or by mistake? And how do you see resolution of the political turmoil that we have been seeing in Israel for some time? In fact, the instability, will it have an impact on regional peace as far as Israel-Palestine issue is concerned? Over to you, sir.
Well, first of all, I've not omitted Hamas. I mentioned it, and particularly when I mentioned the Muslim Brothers. This is actually, Hamas is the Muslim Brothers, the Palestinian Muslim Brothers. Concerning Al-Qaeda, I'm delighted to say there are some nasty things that are not very effective in the Middle East. It had major effects in other parts, but please give us this one opportunity of something nasty that is not manifesting itself primarily in our region. Concerning Israel, I think you have a very interesting phenomenon. I've only recently spoken to people in the US Congress, and I said to them, all my life I was looking for a political system more dysfunctional than the Israeli. Thank you, America. But the Americans have a system where another government is coming, and when it's coming into power, it cannot be toppled. You cannot bring the president down extremely, with the exception of very extreme circumstances. In Israel, we have a perpetual political crisis, but the bad news is the political system is dysfunctional. The good news is that it doesn't matter very much. I mean, Israelis do what they do regardless of their government. We have this political culture of not taking our government too seriously. And everything good in Israel and everything bad in Israel is good or bad regardless of the government. I mean, the government can help Israeli innovation, but they can't stop it even if they wanted. The government can perhaps be less effective in a number of issues, but when it comes to the core issues, there is such a consensus in Israel that we were in a position to conduct a war with Hamas in the Gaza Strip recently, in the midst of the worst political crisis you can imagine, but there was such consensus inside the Israeli military establishment, security establishment, political establishment, the intelligence community, and so on, that actually none of the issues were brought up. And one other thing that people are not aware of and should be aware of, we had recently 4 election campaigns. And in the election campaign, nothing of substance came up because most Israelis agree to practically everything when it comes to the economic order, the social order, the security issues, and so on. So we brought up the corruption of one prime minister and other things that were marginal, but the parties didn't even try to say that they have an alternative. This is the strength of the Israeli society, that the majority of Israelis are in the middle of the political spectrum. Sometimes they call the middle right and sometimes they call the middle left. In the 50s, it was very popular to call people in the center left, and now it is very popular to call people in the center right. But the interesting effect of it is that we are undergoing recently 4 crises: health crisis, economic crisis, military crisis, and political crisis. And we come on top of the 3 other than the political crisis because the political establishment is less important than you can imagine because of this broad consensus. And one last point, if I may, on this subject. Israelis are now facing primarily an economic crisis. Okay, in the background, you have the possibility of a confrontation with Iran, but on an everyday basis, there is an economic crisis. And here is an interesting thing. Every time Israel is challenged with something on the security level, it makes money out of it. Here are a few examples. We've been challenged with thousands of tanks around us, and Israel was attacked in the Yom Kippur War with the largest amount of tanks that we had since the confrontations on the Eastern Front in the Second World War. And then we developed conventional weapons. And now we're selling them at the rate of $8 billion per year. Okay, now $8 billion may not sound much for Indians, but for a tiny country like Israel, it's a lot of money. Then Israel was attacked by terrorism. And today there is hardly an international event where Israeli security experts are not taking the lead, and we make money out of that. Then we were challenged more than any other country that you can possibly imagine with cyber terrorism. The result is that we are number 2 in the world, not per capita, but in real terms when it comes to cyber defense, and we make a lot of money out of it. So now, when you have this pandemic, you need automation and you need elements that can be controlled from afar. And Israel is number 1 of this issue. So when you can turn very bitter lemons into very sweet lemonade, then the problem is that you have so much investment in Israel that the shekel is too strong. We need a shekel for $5 a shekel, and we have a shekel of 3.2 shekels per dollar. This is not what we need. So our problem now is that our currency is too strong because the investment in Israel is so high.
Thank you. Next, Dr. Victoria. I think I have just 2 questions. You talked about Eurasian partnership led by Russia. What are going to be the ingredients of it? Has there any proposal been advocated by the Russians? And second is, what has been stalling the North-South corridor? What is the progress? Because we have been hearing about North-South transport corridor for a long time. But what are the impediments? When do you see it functional completely? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bansal. Well, with the Greater Eurasian Partnership, that's been, I think, from what I've been watching, it's still in the making. So there are still ingredients, as you asked for, the concrete ones. They are being developed at the moment. But the key about is their joint economic, political, social integration of different existing projects, but also provision for infrastructural projects, economic cooperative projects that would ensure stability for all their sites. And but what is interesting is that the concept is still being worked out, at least the one that would provide for proper steps. And of course, but we do need each and every actor to be a willing partner for the development of economic cooperation. With the North-South corridor, I would say generally it's more about, from what I see at least, more about politics and security than economics. And there were a lot of mentions from part of their speakers of the Iranian role, but this is a tripartite. And I see each of the sides being eager to invest in the problems, but I see politics as being, or security as primary hampering factor in this regard. So this is short. I know we are already running quite late. That's why I'll keep it here.
Our last speaker, Dr. Mirwais Balkhi, there are questions on Afghanistan, which I read earlier, but there is another one, which again, I would reiterate. This is the same thing where a questioner has asked whether Nepal model can be replicated in Afghanistan. And he has cited that when former Minister Habiba Sarabi and her delegation visited Nepal, she said she and her delegation was in Nepal to learn about Nepal's peace process so as to guide the peace process in Afghanistan. So over to you, whether Nepal model can be replicated in Afghanistan, and the other questions. How do you see the future of Afghan peace process, and what does the peace process entail for women, sectarian and religious minorities, as well as ethnic minorities? And why is violence rising despite the ongoing peace process? Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bansal. I support Vishal's position about the nature of conflict here in Afghanistan. Well, Meena was talking about insurgency. I do not support that, because the Afghanistan conflict nature is more regional one, which is a state-sponsored conflict by supporting or sponsoring different terrorist groups here in Afghanistan to reach their traditional objectives, what the Pakistanis are always following here in Afghanistan. But the accommodation policy, we have simply, as I was talking about, the fatigue among the Taliban groups also in different parts of the country, because some of the commandership and some of the factions here in Afghanistan in different parts of the country, recently when there was an uprising from the people from the Northern Alliance region, it gave the message to Taliban that they cannot take power in Afghanistan alone by their military approach in Afghanistan, and that's why there is discussions and arguments among them, so that if they can find an accommodating policy themselves, not even the government of Afghanistan. That is why the simple propositions from the government of Afghanistan is a power sharing, so that those who will disconnect themselves from the international terrorist groups or from Pakistan, they can join the government of Afghanistan, they can have their own share, and they can have a joint government. So that's the simple propositions that the government and the people here in Afghanistan, even those who have been the oppositions to the government of Kabul, they also propose the same. So that is why some of the militant group, paramilitaries who are earning from different sources in across the countries. But Vishal was also emphasizing on that. That is true that they are earning a huge amount from these sources, and they will continue fighting, not even ideologically, but also for their own interest. But some of other factions in the Western Afghanistan, in Northern Afghanistan, they recently are talking about how they have to go so that the conflict in Afghanistan is not continued for long run. That's the first question. About the Nepalese peace process model for Afghanistan, unfortunately, I'm not focused on South Asia a lot. I'm focused on West Asia. That's why I don't have much information about what the delegation have learned from Nepali peace process model, what Minister Habiba Sarabi and colleagues, they learned from there. But what I can say is that when I was in my studies in India and I was focusing on Nepal cases, I can say that there is a big difference in significance of the conflict between Nepal and Afghanistan. That is why I don't believe that the Nepalese model of peace process can work here in Afghanistan, because we have learned also from Tajikistan internal conflicts, and we could not achieve anything from that lesson. So the High Peace Council here in Afghanistan, they are doing research on many cases around the world, so that if they can find some of the similarities, and on the basis of that similarities, they can achieve something for Afghan peace process. I don't think they could find something, because when I was discussing with them, the Afghanistan is a unique case. The significance of the conflict is unique. So that is why I don't think it can work. But the post-withdrawal situation for the minorities, of course, it gives very vulnerabilities for the people, for the women, for the new generation here in Afghanistan, and for the ethnic minorities, linguistic minorities, because sometimes, unfortunately, the conflicts here in Afghanistan gives the significance of ethnic orient. So that is why this makes more clashes between the ethnic groups and then some of the vulnerables who are somehow trying to accommodate themselves. That is why recently thousands and thousands of the young generation of women, active women or women activists, they are leaving Afghanistan because of the uncertain conditions that we have here in Afghanistan. And that is why, unfortunately, here in Kabul, majority of us, we believe that the Americans, they are giving wrong announcement always. Even the post-2014 was a nightmare for everyone, which resulted to the brain drain among the Afghan intellectuals and Afghan scholars, Afghan technocrats who have left Afghanistan. But after some time, when there was not foundational changes and consequences, then they returned back to Afghanistan. So nowadays also, when they talk about how they have to shift, for example, the translators, the mediators, and different other factions of the country, that they have to leave Afghanistan, that also created the same condition. That is why the Taliban, they found a very self-confidence for themselves, and they always talk about the same reputations that the government of Afghanistan, they have clock, but we have time. So the time will give achievements for them. But that is why we also in Afghanistan always convey the same message to the Americans, that since they are conveying, or since they are continuing their support to the andSF, to Afghan government, that is the major confidence for the military in Afghanistan. to oppose Taliban. So the joint government ANDSF and the people uprising, I'm sure will give this conclusion to Taliban so that their fatigue level is the true and they cannot win Afghanistan by military means. Thank you.
Thank
Mr.
you,
Chair,
Dr.
can I add one point? Just one point.
Just quickly take 15 seconds. We are already beyond.
I think we need to understand how Taliban has structured the leadership. Taliban is headed by Amirul Mominin, leader of the faithful. Now he cannot be taking up a cabinet position in any political setup. That is not possible. So I don't think we should be comparing Taliban with any other group. Secondly, very important, all these agreements or peace efforts, they're as indifferent to the future of Afghanistan as they are to the past, including the outcomes of the Geneva Accords signed in 1988. Last point, I think the peace efforts in Afghanistan have to go local, a bottom-up approach, where efforts are made at the subnational levels, provincial, district level, where it works fine. If it doesn't, that is why I said Afghanistan would have to put up a united front. There's a strong external dimension to the insurgency, which has to be understood. Otherwise, Bonn process was able to accommodate the different interests, mutually exclusive interests of various groups in Afghanistan. If left to themselves, I'm sure Afghanistan have enough wisdom as an ancient civilization to find their way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'd like to thank all the speakers for wonderful presentations and for sticking to timelines. Thank you so much. Over to Pramod.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bansal and everyone here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Over to the organizers. Take over.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair.
Speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we have come to the end of this session, we would like to express a sincere gratitude and thanks to the chair for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, we must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making this session productive with your questions. Once again, we are truly honored to have you all with us today. Please do join us in the next session. Thank you so much.